All right, welcome everyone to this webinar that today will be about VR simulations and if or whether they should replace traditional science labs. So really excited to have you here, and joining us is Mike Angeletta from ASU. Welcome, Mike.
Hi, Maria. Thanks.
Right, so brief introduction to myself before we talk about Mike. I'm Maria, and you've probably seen me before in previous webinars. I work with marketing at Labster. If you have any questions throughout the webinar, after the webinar, any comments, any feedback, please email it over to maria@labster.com. Now, Mike, you are the Professor of Ecology and the Associate Director of Undergraduate Programs in the School of Life Sciences at Arizona State University. So tell us, what does that mean? What is your role at ASU?
That means I run everything that has to do with our 5,000 undergraduate students. And those are 3,700 students on ground and 1,370 students online. So we have both an on-campus and online program that is quite large. We have a whole bunch of degrees, but our largest degrees are biomedical sciences and biological sciences, which are your basic, biology programs that you find in most places. And so I basically am in charge of developing new degree programs, running the current degree programs, making sure advising, scheduling, all this stuff happens. That's in a nutshell what I have to do.
Right, and we'll dig much more into sort of what you do in your ecology course in a bit. And before we do that, I think we'll just rewind a little bit and go back to why sort of ASU and Labster work together and where it all started. So I don't know, many of you probably know already, last summer we launched the Google Labster and ASU collaboration to launch the first VR biology degree in the world. It's a biology of sciences a Bachelor of Sciences in Biology, and it uses VR as a core part of the course. So Mike, you're like one of the very first people to teach with VR. It's really exciting. That's why we invited you to tell us your experiences, because you just finished a course, a 6-week course with the VR simulations, right? So it's going to be really exciting to hear what you've learned. So it's all fresh and all fresh insights here that you're sharing with us today.
That's right. I literally just got the survey results from my students yesterday.
Right. And that's really exciting. I think, of course, most important is what do the students think, right? So that's one of the things we're going to be covering. We're also going to be talking about what are the pros and cons of using virtual labs, also in VR specifically. And the million-dollar question, if VR labs can replace traditional ones. So stay tuned for all that. Before we dig into all of this, we just wanted to make sure that we knew where you are all coming from. So we wanted to include you and ask you these 2 questions that you have here. Why are you interested in VR labs, and what are your concerns about virtual labs if you have any? So basically, we know that there are many of you out there who probably already use virtual labs, many who are maybe just interested in it and want to learn more before you get started with it. And then maybe there are some of you who don't ever want to get started with it, but just want to hear what other people are thinking and saying. So whoever you are, please share your comments in the questions section. So just send those answers along. And to give you a bit of an incentive to do that, we just want to give away a VR headset today. So if you enter those comments into the questions box, then we will send you we will draw a winner and send the winner a VR headset at the end of the webinar, or by at the end, when it's over.
That's a pretty sweet giveaway, Maria.
Sorry?
That's a pretty sweet giveaway.
I know, right? We did it last time, and we got one of our previous webinars as well, and the winner was very happy. So we hope to be able to do that again and give away a bit of joy. Many of you probably already have a VR headset or have used it. This one is a Lenovo Mirage Solar one, the one that we recommend for using Labster with. So moving on, and we'll get back to these questions in a little bit. I can see that you're already typing in all of your questions. So Mike, tell us, where did all of this start for you? Because at some point you decided to use Labster against other kinds of virtual labs out there. So where did it start for you?
Right. So in 2017-ish, I was in my job as head of undergrad programs. I was told, more or less, by the dean, we were going to develop an online degree, an entire online degree that confers a Bachelor of Science in Biology. And the biggest hurdle, I mean, we had a lot of hurdles, but we had been teaching online for a while, so we had a lot of courses that were online. But the biggest hurdle remaining was how are we going to complete the curriculum by delivering advanced lab courses? So many of you listening may know that there are a variety of ways you could teach labs, but most of these simulation products that you buy are targeted at the introductory level. So there's another product called Late Night Labs, which we had used in another course, and we looked at, and we met with several companies, and some companies have, for example, simulation labs for one advanced course, such as ecology, like EcoSim, but there was no single solution, right? And so during that process, I met with Maruf from Labster, and he showed me the labs that you guys had. But what really struck out to me about those labs is not just it was like another option, but it was a very different kind of option. So the labs that you build in Labster tend to be narrative driven, meaning there's a story. And that's a really, I think, important key to learning, because students get engaged when they think there's a reason why they're exploring a problem. And not the reason is, well, you got to do this lab, right? Or you have to find this solution. But the reason is something they can relate to, a real world problem. And so I think it was a crime scene or something like that. Maru said, we're going to have to go back to the lab and we're going to do some gels and things like that. And I'm not a cell biologist or molecular biologist, but I could understand that there was a reason for this. And I said to Maruf, this is really cool. I'm interested. And he goes, oh, yeah, by the way, we could put any of these labs into virtual reality. And then I went, what? And so we talked more. He gave me a headset. I put on the headset. There was some Cirque du Soleil thing, I think. It was just sort of a demo. It wasn't even a lab at that point. And I was like, I didn't want to come out of the headset, right? I was there. So Mike, come back to the meeting. And so I said to him, look, I don't want to build a lab or a few labs. I want to build an entire degree's worth of labs. Can we do that? And that's where it started.
That's so cool. I think at that point, I mean, it's also like, you co-created these labs, right? Which is quite unique. Not everyone gets to do that, of course. And I think it's really, really exciting that you were so excited by the VR headset. I had that same experience the first time I put on the VR headset. It was just like such a novel experience and nothing like anything you'd ever really tried before. So yeah, that's
I don't know if you want me to get into the details of what we developed, or that's later in.
No, absolutely. Let's do that, because so created lots of virtual lab simulations. I think it was 30 in total that the collaboration was about.
Yeah, so it took about a year to figure it out, but we partnered with Google eventually and found the funding to develop about 30 simulations. And those simulations are all in VR, and they make up 3 courses that we launched over the last year. So the first course was cell biology labs. The next course was ecology labs, and then the last course to launch this summer are animal physiology labs. So we wanted these courses to span, I mean, we couldn't do all of our lab courses, obviously, but we wanted them to span sort of the range of biological levels of organization, from molecular up to ecosystems. And so I teach in the ecology labs, and so I co-developed the 10 ecology labs as Labster. And co-develop means, Labster did all the coding, and they did a lot of the storylines, and I basically will look at these things. I say, here's the learning goals that I want, right? And the learning goals, of course, there's a whole set for the course. And then we decided how to scaffold those learning goals so that students would do the labs in a logical progression. And then they went ahead and provided me with the storyline for the lab, and I would comment on that. And then they provided me with simulations of what the lab would look like, like mock-ups and drawings, and I commented on that. So the whole way, I was a partner in providing feedback and making sure that when the labs were received, my students would get the learning outcomes that I thought that they should have. And they would have an experience that I thought would not be too confusing for them or would be engaging enough for them.
Yeah, that's really great. And I'm already looking at some of the questions that are coming in.
Sure.
We have a lot of people saying that they're just really interested in learning about VR, because it's quite a, it's something that not a lot of people know where to get the information about. So they've come to the right place, because obviously you can speak from firsthand experience.
Sure.
Another place to look for great information about that is the research that's out there. Is ASU doing more, is ASU working on research as well on publishing what you guys are learning right now?
We have a part of ASU called Ed Plus, which is actually in charge of all of the online and innovative online technologies that we use in classes. And there are people there who are, actually there's a guy there who did his dissertation on VR. And so he is collecting data on the courses. and we gave out about 35 headsets to students at each course for free. We said we're renting these to you. You have to mail them back to us at no cost to you, and we want you to use them and tell us what you think, and also we're going to be able to look at how well they did. To be honest, I mean, and I'm expecting that VR is primarily going to affect how they feel about the lab, not how much they learned, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's consistent with what people have found before. And to be clear, you can do these labs without buying a VR headset. We don't require students to purchase a VR headset. They can simply purchase a license to Labster, which for many courses is part of their fee, course fee, like they would a textbook. And they go into Labster and they can do it on their laptop. And being like almost 50, I sometimes do that too. Right? I don't always buy a VR headset, right? But the ones that do the VR headset feel like they're really engaged. They're kind of immersed in it, and it's very hard for them to get distracted by things around them because they are literally surrounded by the laboratory.
Yeah, and we'll get much more into specific student feedback in a little bit as well. I think, yeah, I'm just looking at these questions. There are a lot, guys, so we will be getting back to them along the way as I think they come up and are relevant. We will also get back to you with questions or with answers for your questions after the webinar. So you will get them answered, don't worry about it. So now that, let's just see, I'm just gonna bring up one more question here. That is, because you said before that you might choose to do the VR labs instead of the desktop simulations, and I think a lot of people I can see here are really also looking at what is the research on one compared to the other. Is there research out there? And like you say, maybe it's more about each individual person trying to figure out what works for them, and then not so much looking at what the research studies show, because there is a lot of variation in the data, I think. What do you think?
I think you're right. So if you talk to students, every student that uses VR for a few minutes is going to think it's really cool. And of course, anytime they think something they have to do for a class is really cool, that's a good thing, right? It's a good way to get them to actually do what they have to do. But then some people, when they use VR for 20, 30, 40 minutes, they start to, they get a headache, or it's kind of like wearing those 3D glasses when you go to the movies. If you don't like them, you're not going to like the movie. Yeah. And so we want to force those students to do it. And some students actually aren't economically in a position to put another $400 or $300 into the courses that they're going to take. Now they can use the VR goggles in 5 courses that we have at ASU, but we don't want to impose that as a necessity, because we don't think the data are strong that using 2D versus VR actually causes you to learn something more. If you're interested in learning, you're going to learn it either way. But what it does, I think, is for students that need that sort of extra incentive to do their schoolwork, it can actually make them more excited about doing their schoolwork. And so that's why. And so I think you're right. It's going to be student dependent, and some students that get excited about VR immediately are going to find that VR may not be for them. But there are a large number of students that really like the VR experience, and so they invest in that for the fact that we have 5 labs that we offer in VR, 5 courses we offer in VR. Right.
And I mean, an important point here is also maybe just that, when you are in VR, you are like some of the data that is out there, that some of the research showing the results of VR right now, it shows that it's just very immersive, like that you can't help but be immersed in it, of course, because you are 100% inside a simulation. And obviously teachers like the fact that their students can't be sitting on their phones or something during a course, which it's just not physically possible, obviously.
And to the extent that immersion helps you to actually recall later, in other words, your focus is more lasered in on what you're trying to do, then it would have benefits for learning. Right, but of course, that said, if the student didn't have their phone on in the first place, that would also help, right? Well, we know the real world is like that.
Right. But yeah, let's just, because there is a lot of research on this, and and you can read. We have all of it over at labster.com/research. You can also reach out to our research team at research@labster.com if you want to learn much more about that, because there is way more to learn, by the way. Okay, so let's move on a little bit, I wanted to show you guys one of the simulations, a little video of one of the simulations that you are teaching with Mike. So I'm just going to put on a little video here. While I get this. And this one is behavioral thermoregulation.
Oh, okay. Yeah, so just to give a little background while you're loading this. So all of these ecology labs take place on another planet that was discovered sometime in the future. I think this is a genius idea that Labster came up with, because I wanted to base these out of Arizona where we teach. And they said, well, what if we built them somewhere else? And the advantages are students can't Google any of the answers, right?
Right.
They can't cheat because the answers are all made up for organisms that don't exist, right? So they're plausible chemical and physically based organisms, but they don't exist. They're not animals, they're not plants. None of the preconceived assumptions that they would have about things don't work. And so they actually have to work through the lab simulation. And
right.
so
And I'm just gonna show this short video first, and then we'll talk much more about it in a second. Okay, so hang on here. All right, so this is the behavioral thermoregulation simulation. As with all of them, they start with this little introduction to the simulation, what it's about, the mission, the theory, and an introduction to the lab pad and to Dr. One over here, who's your virtual lab guide. As you move on into the simulation, you are now introduced to the Gexi. So researchers are planning to take specimens of different species, including this Gexi, from an exoplanet called Astrakos 4 to keep in a biodome on Earth. Now, in order to recreate the right habitat to keep Gexis alive on Earth, the student has to learn about thermoregulation and the various strategies Gexis use to thermoregulate. You'll see the three different environments the Gexi can live in here. So you have the desert, the shrubland, and the forest. The student is right from the beginning challenged with different quiz questions. They can look at the theory on the lab pad and the screen and models in the lab to answer these questions. Then the students are let loose and set on their mission into the field. So I'm just going to fast forward a little bit here through the quiz questions. We're teleporting now to this new environment, the desert, and you can test different temperatures. You can feed or hydrate the Gexi. You can place it in the shade and make the right decisions in the attempt to keep the Gexi alive. So it's quite exciting for the students. They can then teleport from one environment to another in a matter of seconds, really, and just experience by trial and error how the different behaviors and the different environments affect the Gexi. This is something, of course, that you wouldn't really be able to do if it weren't for a virtual environment. They can study the data in 3D models. They can continue to answer quiz questions throughout the entire simulation. So we're just going to fast forward again through this. So as we see here, we're in different environments, different quiz questions, and different challenges. And so they answer these quiz questions throughout the entire simulation to ensure that they're following along and actively learning instead of just passively listening. And they can go at their own speed, they can read theory, they can look at the data if they want, or they can go through the questions in a matter of minutes if they find the questions more easy. So this was the behavioral thermoregulation simulation.
So Marie, at the beginning there, my screen was black. I don't know if everyone could see the whole beginning.
I think they could. I hope they could. At least, let me just get a check here.
I picked up the video right where they went to the desert.
Oh, right. Okay.
And I could
well,
see the in the background.
We hope that most of you could see most of the video at least. Sorry about the technical difficulties here. But Mike, before you were saying that one of the really cool things about this simulation is that you can, or the student can't come in with any preconceived ideas. And I think that's really a cool thing to highlight. So tell us a little bit more about that and why you decided to include that in the simulations.
Well, the options that we toyed with were, one, it could be an island that was discovered somewhere, right? So that they wouldn't know something about it. But the problem is then we would be constrained to choose things from a nearby mainland. Like things that were on the island would have to come from somewhere, and students would obviously know that. And therefore, that would also constrain the sort of life and the processes that were on there. And then going back to my original one is like, if it were actually in some place on Earth, then of course they could just go to Google and find all the answers to anything that stumped them. So it seemed like a really great idea to start over. The challenge was, however, to create a world that seemed novel enough, but not bizarre, so bizarre, right, that it didn't recognize things. So you could see the Gexi is based on a lizard-like creature. It is plausible that a lizard-like creature would have evolved by convergent evolution. I mean, why not? We've got all kinds of marsupials and placental mammals that look nearly identical, right, to your eye, that have evolved convergently. So we have these things, but of course they don't necessarily have to be like geckos on Earth, right? They're just named Gexis because they look to us like geckos on Earth.
Right. Yeah, and I think that's a really great. I think these, I mean, just going through these different kinds of simulations, they're also really, just inspiring universes and really fun and just, a cool experience for a student to go through. And it's again something that you really can't do in the real world.
The student actually is like playing a game. They're literally trying to keep that animal. Oh, it's not really an animal technically, but it looks like an animal from overheating or getting too cold. And what's really important is that they're not focused on what it is about that organism, but they're focused on how it exchanges heat with its environment, radiation, conduction, convection. And those are the things they would have read about in their textbook, in the lecture part of the course, and now they have to put those into practice by saying, can I manage the heat balance of this organism by putting it in the right microenvironments at different times when it's hitting certain body temperatures. And also check off the risk of predation, which that thing will get eaten in some of those simulations if it stays too long in certain areas. So it's a pretty cool way, I think, for students to learn about thermoregulation.
Right, and they can, I think another advantage is just the fact that you can test or you can work with a virtual live Gexi who will never get hurt, because if the student fails, in real life, the Gexi would get hurt, and that's something that I think is also really cool. Just being an animal lover, it matters to me that you can test these things out.
Yeah, labs with vertebrate animals and field labs are very expensive. So going to a field site would be very expensive. Having vertebrate animals in the lab requires you to fill out paperwork, IACUC protocols for institutional animal care and use committees. And so you get around all these issues, but the students still feel like they're doing, and we'll look at the student data later about how they feel about the labs.
Yeah. All right, cool. Well, before we dig into the student data, I think we should have a look at what the pros and cons are of teaching with virtual labs, because now you've completed the 6 weeks of the course, the ecology course, and you've been gaining a lot of insights and learned a lot about what it's been like. So what would you say, first of all, that you can do in a virtual lab? I mean, we've talked about a little bit now, but what you can do in a virtual lab that you can't do in a traditional lab?
Yeah, so students actually in some of the comments recognize what I think is the greatest advantage of a virtual lab is that you can do anything, right? So you could work on a piece of equipment that's beyond the scope of what your university can afford, and you personally as a student can do it. And that leads to the next advantage. You can do it more than once. You can come back and do it the next day and the day later. These labs never close. They're open to students for the entire semester that we run the course. And so students can progress at their own pace. If they want to do one lab 3 or 4 times, we allow them to do them over and over again, and we allow them actually to improve their score, because we want to treat these labs as formative assessment, what we say in the education world, that they're not being penalized the first time for not knowing how to do a lab perfectly. The whole point is for them to do a lab to practice being a scientist. Like, they've never done that thermoregulation lab before, so why would we expect them to get a perfect score? But what we wanted to encourage them to do, which you can't do on campus, right? Because if you have 1,000 students in a course, running through a course in the course of a week, they're in lab for 3 hours and they're out, right? And you got another group of students in lab for the next 3 hours and out, right? It's like a constant turnaround. And that's it. If they missed lab because they were sick or they didn't really understand it, tough. They're gonna have to look at their friends' notes. Whereas here they can go back in, and students do these labs multiple times, so an average of 2 point some times each. And so that's one advantage. And then those are actually a couple advantages. Well, the clear disadvantage, though, is that you miss the tactile things, right? So this is where I'm excited to enter VR early, because I know that, like everything else with technology, can you imagine when I was a kid, I used a little Commodore 64 computer. Before that, I had an Atari. Now look at my sons playing basketball. It looks like a real basketball player on the screen, compared to the basketball game which I play, which is like a stick and a dot, right, moving around on the screen. So imagine now VR, because it's in gaming, within 10 years, I'm assuming we're going to have far greater VR capacity in terms of processors, in terms of other things. People are working on, for example, gloves that you might wear. And I imagine one day that the disadvantage of not being able to feel, we're going to figure out a solution, right? And it's probably going to come from advances in gaming. But when it's there, education will be ready to say, okay, we want to feel like we're pouring liquid. And I know an engineer here at ASU is working on research, and that's exactly what he's trying to do, create these gloves that will have this sort of tactile response. Now, well, in the meantime, I think it's a pretty good substitute for many things. And what we do in class is we don't just use VR. So we use these 10 labs, but then I also have them go and do assignments with real data and have them make field observations in field sites of their choice around their home. And then I have them create hypotheses and design experiments. And those are all based on the skills and knowledge that they got from Labster, right? The conceptual skills and knowledge of how to generate hypotheses and think about problems, how to design experiments. So they're doing all that in Labster as a simulation. They could go out in their backyard even and do that kind of stuff for the rest of the course.
Yeah. So what you're saying basically is, of course, that there are a lot of things that you can't do in a virtual lab, but there are also a lot of things that you can do. And definitely the tactile element is an important one. It's also something that we've heard. At the same time, there are things like something we've heard before is, students get nauseous in the VR simulations, whereas that's something that's really been a lot of development in this past year. Just, a lot of improvement has happened already so that we see now a lot of students don't have that problem anymore. So, definitely a field where a lot of stuff is happening, and it's really exciting time.
Cell biology lab, for example, one of the tactile things that so professors always point this out right away, especially if they're not tech savvy. They say, well, we can't do this because, in a pipette lab, you got to know that there's 2 stops on a pipette. The first stop's for this and the second stop's for that. And I say, look, to the professor, look, I didn't know that. I don't pipette. I'm a scientist, just like you're a scientist. Every scientist does different things. So the assumption is, one, that every student needs to know that about a pipette. Like they're going to go on to use that particular pipette in their career, and they'll never learn how to use it in a lab that they work in. And 2, that just because you can't do that in VR doesn't mean you can't use VR labs in your course. So what I would say to that professor is, then students need to get a pipette, and then they practice that skill independent of VR, right? So we say, what is it about VR that you can learn on a computer, and what are the learning goals that you can't hit? And tactile skills like that, specialized skills, are your goal. Say it's a 400 level microbiology lab and you got to know that. You really got to know that. Then why not mail them a pipette and have them do stuff on video, right? To show that they could actually pipette the right amounts, So there are ways around this. And I think that when you recognize what the cons are, then you figure out a different solution. And that's what we've done for the online degree.
I think that's really interesting. A student that just a question that just popped up here as well, which is kind of related to this whole discussion, is that if students miss the interaction with other students or with teachers, because now that you bring it online, like how do you get around that sort of communication that you then don't have when you're in a face-to-face lab?
Yeah, that's a really great question, and it's very ironic that I can have more direct face-to-face interaction with my online students than on-ground students, because when I go to a class that I teach on campus, there are about 400 students in the lecture hall, and they see my face, but I have no idea who they are. And I barely learn the names of any of them. Sometimes I have them do name cards, so I pretend to know their names, but I barely know the names of any of them. Whereas in the online labs, what I do is I replace that 3 hours of lecture each week with 3 hours of virtual office hours, and I have them vote every week on what the best times are, so they can change every week what the office hours are. And then I set those hours up on a video conferencing system like this. And they come in, and so the students that take advantage of that class time, right? I really know who they are because I am talking to them, and then I record that. And for students that can't make those times, I tell them to email me answers, and I email me questions, and I record the answers to their questions, and I post it. So I do feel like they certainly get the same presence of me being the instructor for that reason. And for the students that take advantage of those virtual chat times, I actually get a better idea of who they are than I would if I were teaching them in a lecture hall. I think it's easier for them to click in and ask questions on their computer at home than to come to my office hours outside of class time, especially when they get to vote on when those office hours are. So the whole online environment, makes the way you teach very different.
Right.
But not necessarily worse, maybe better.
Yeah. It really would depend. And we're going to get to the student feedback as well in a little bit. I just wanted, before I proceed, I saw a comment here that someone at least did watch the entire video. So we're just going to do another one, a little short one, to show one of the biodiversity simulation actually. So here we go. And I'm just going to hit play. Right, so here we're in the biodiversity simulation where the students set out on a mission to explore the biodiversity in a desert. First, they meet Francisco, who's an ecologist working on the exoplanet Astrikos 4. They're also introduced to this cool new environment with lots of new plants and creatures that they have never encountered before. The smart thing about this new environment is that the students won't come with any preconceived ideas about the plants and creatures. So instead of making assumptions, they'll have to learn about and understand the theory first, and then they can acquire information and make decisions and judgments based on that. So for example, the students learn on Earth, you typically find the highest biodiversity at intermediate altitudes, and if you climb up a mountain or move down into the lowlands, the biodiversity usually decreases. But is that also the case on Astrikos 4? There's only one way to find out, and that is to investigate the new planet and sample and compare the biodiversity from the different environments on the planet. So then the student and their ecologist friend go from the desert to the bushes to way up in the mountain forests to explore these different environments. Before they go out and sample, they have to learn about the different methods available. So let's just see if we can fast forward a bit here to the lab. So they teleport back to this lab and they learn about these different methods. And as time and resources are limited in the real world, they also learn to prioritize the different methods so that their time in the field isn't wasted. And then they go off again into the field. Here we go. Here they set up their sampling and wait to see what they find. Now, luckily, because we're in a virtual world, you can fast forward to get the results again. So here and here's some sampling that you can see and the quiz questions. Different kind of sampling up in the forests and back in the lab. The student is also quizzed about good practice for sampling, such as how you should check your trap regularly so no animals can dehydrate or overheat in the traps. In case the student doesn't know this yet, it is safe to make mistakes in the virtual world, but once they start working in the real field, they can't make these kinds of mistakes. So in that way, virtual reality is perfect for teaching students these things because they can correct their errors before they go and have real consequences.
Well, Maria, real consequence would be being bitten by that thing that you were holding.
That was a slubster, wasn't it? As far as I remember.
Yeah. I have to say, I didn't make up the names, the cute names. I didn't do that.
Yeah, I think the simulation directors had a lot of fun. So the people who create these simulations on the, scientific part, when it's not a professor involved in deciding what the content should be, we have simulation directors who are educated in, microbiology or chemistry or whatever it is it's about. And I think they enjoy coming up with these, or they really enjoyed it for this case, coming up with these little creatures. So, right. So we just have a quick question here as well. Mike, I think someone asked what class size you had as well.
Yeah, this is the first run of the course, and we had about 85 students. And so I've got survey results to share with you from 65 of those students who voluntarily filled out the survey. It's been about that size. We've run it now, ecology course twice now. I think it will grow because it's not a required course. So the cell biology course, which is required for some of the degrees, I think maybe a little bit bigger, that we ran in the fall, and I can't remember, but it was at least 100 students. And then the animal physiology course we run in the summer, maybe even bigger than that. But we have a system where you can scale the courses, and the way it works is our unit receives money directly for students that enroll. So if we have 50 more students, we hire another facilitator, TA, instructor, whatever you'd like to call the person. I mean, the roles, the traditional roles kind of break down online. So they might be a graduate TA, but they're facilitating the course in the way that I would online for that 50 additional students. So with that system, you can scale this. I don't see a problem scaling this to an infinite number of students if we can find the facilitators, to do the courses.
Yeah. All right. I'm just trying to answer some more questions here while we're at it. So I got one here about if the lab students visit and use sometimes realistic simulations of expensive laboratory equipment, or if it's just mostly these sort of other world-like environments. And just to clear that up, yeah, go ahead.
So now I teach ecology lab, so the whole premise is it's on this other world. Sometimes though they're in the lab, right, and they're using lab equipment because they go back to the lab, they teleport back and forth. That's another thing students like that I mentioned before, is that it speeds things up. So the boring stuff that they would be doing in a real lab, like waiting and not necessarily learning, is just sped up. But in cell bio and animal physiology, absolutely, they're going to be doing all kinds of different things. So they work with microscopes and gels and their PCRs and stuff in the cell bio lab. I don't teach that, so I can't talk too much about. I don't even use those techniques, so I can't even talk too much about them. But you could try those labs at Labster, and I think the 2D versions of those labs show you pretty well what, if you're on your computer screen checking them out, what it would look like.
Yeah, we just got another question if we can try out one of the cell biology simulations, and we do have those, but I unfortunately don't have a little preview of it right now. If you contact us at labster.com/pricing, you can try them. Sorry, go ahead.
Let's get you an idea of like one of the things I liked about the cell bio labs. I did try them, and so you say to yourself, well, do you really learn anything about being in a lab? And I would say, well, I learned that you have to put on a new pipette tip each time. Because I would be putting on my pipette tip. Literally, you have to go put your pipette tip on, and you got to pick up some solution, and then you got to dispense the solution. And then I tried to go get more, but I can't. It won't let me because I have to discard my pipette tip in the little waste bin, right? And then I have to go get another one. And I, again, not pipetting all the time, I didn't have that muscle memory. I can tell you, you will develop the muscle memory for how to work with a pipette. Maybe not the tactile feel, but certainly the muscle memory, because you have to do all that when you're pipetting in these labs, which I thought was pretty cool.
Yeah, I did the same one. We have a whole simulation about pipetting. So, I mean, if you didn't learn it in the cell bio one, you will in that one as well. I tried it. I was like, is this really necessary? But I mean, it is, because that's how you learn to do it. You can't proceed if you don't do it right. So that's really cool, I think, as well.
And so another thing people might want to know is like, what's the state of the technology in terms of, well, is it like Grand Theft Auto, where my kid can play that game, he can go anywhere. It's like, Dad, I'm going to go steal a car, and then maybe later I'm going to take a helicopter, or maybe I'll do the helicopter first, right? He can decide what he wants to do. All right, so now, of course, we're not stealing cars in this game, but the point is, VR is a lot more prescribed at this point. So it's more like a lab where the progress is limited. Like, you have to do this exercise now, and this exercise is done in a certain way. So at the moment, these labs are more aligned to the kinds of labs where you progress through from beginning to end, because it's story driven and because of the technological limitations of having everything work on Wi-Fi through the things. But I can imagine 5 to 10 years from now, and some of the students even said that, like, if this is the beginning, I'm really excited to see where it's going to go, and I'm actually disappointed I'm going to graduate before it gets there. Because what happens is eventually, with enough investment in technology and development, we're going to have the kinds of things where the student could just walk around in a lab and decide, well, I'm going to conduct this experiment now, and then later I'm going to do that thing, and somehow the processor will be able to keep track of all that.
Absolutely. I think it's a really good point that you bring up there, is that our simulations are built around these stories and like these learning loops, I believe they call them, our simulation directors, where, you have a beginning and an end, and where you just they start the simulations, creating the simulations based on what the learning outcome should be, right? So it's very much about making sure that those are achieved. And so if you give the student the access to just go in and do like everything possible, it's less likely that they'll actually learn what that was intended to be. So I think that's why they've built them the way that they did. But it's also something that I think is, like you say, it would be really cool to have that at one point where you just go in and just explore and experiment with everything available. And I think definitely one day it will be possible. It's just about prioritizing really what is the most effective or efficient way of learning as it is with what we have now. So yeah, but it's really, building the content. I don't know how many of you guys saw, actually last week we announced our huge investment round. So we've gotten a lot of money from these great investors to actually build out the content to make sure that you guys can have exactly what you're looking for in terms of content. And we're really excited to make that happen. So that's something that you can look forward to as well. And along with that, some additional support and for both the students and professors. So much more on that on labster.com if you want to read about it. So let's move on. I think you've talked about some of the great things, some of the limitations definitely as well of the virtual labs. I think maybe we should go on to see what the students said about the simulations.
Yeah, sure.
Oops, here we go.
I gave a basic survey to all my students, and it was anonymous, And what you're seeing here is the percentage of students that said, it was a classic Likert scale with strongly agree, not sure, disagree, strongly disagree. So you're seeing the percentage of students that either agreed or strongly agreed with the statement there. And it's 65 students in total that responded. So what I think is really interesting, and I ordered these questions in what I thought would be most relevant, right? First of all, do you feel like you're actually in a lab when you're in Labster? And 80% of students would have felt like they were in a real lab. Well, that's pretty good, because honestly, I mean, it doesn't look exactly like a real lab. Yeah, it does look like a cartoon of a lab, right? So if you can get past the idea that you're in a cartoon of a lab and you start to forget that you're not in a lab as you're doing things, that's great. So I have to say, I have to point out, I said to Maria, I literally got these data yesterday, and I was really pleased because I had no idea whether students liked the course or not, whether they liked the labs that we had created. And so by and large, they're pretty positive. 97% of students said they felt more confident about their skills. I asked other questions that you don't see here related to the assignments. Specifically, did Labster simulations help you with this assignment or that assignment? And those were also above 80% as well. So they're around, most of the responses were around 85%. So there was one student that said, she got headaches from the VR, so she stopped using it and used the 2D. There was another student that said he didn't think Labster Labs could replace on-ground labs, and that's fine. We have options. If students want to come to campus for a week, they can come to campus and take an accelerated on-ground lab. But most of the students seem to think that, as you can see from the last one, I feel that I can apply what I learned in the simulations to cases in the real world. So they feel like, this kind of training is giving them the background they need to do something real. And these students did, in fact, have to go out for 5 weeks to a field site, make observations, generate hypotheses, and design an experiment. So they have some basis on which to answer that question. Maria, did you have any questions coming to the audience about this? About what they've done?
Let me just check here. These are mostly just related to the videos we got before. Let me see. I think people are just really interested in hearing what you have to say about these, the student feedback. I can tell.
I noticed that I copied the same question twice. Actually, I just noticed that one of these questions is actually supposed to be, and I'll correct what it is. We just did these, literally, I got these yesterday, so I just did this slide for Maria real quick. Sorry, the last one, which is 98%, the question's actually this. I would like to use simulations in Labster in addition to or instead of real lab exercises. 98%. And so that's the one. When I read it, I was like, that didn't sound what I thought I was going to read. That told me that the students liked it, right? 98% thought even if they were going to do a real lab in class, they would like to use Labster first to prepare for that real lab. And then I think, Maria, is one of the studies that you have where there were 3 groups in the study. One group did the Labster lab on how to plate smear, did like a microbiology experiment, right? And then another group did Labster and then were shown how to do it. And a third group were just shown how to do it. And they looked at the ability of students to do this task in the lab after they had been in one of those 3 treatments. And if I recall, there was no difference. So that, being in the Labster simulation was as good as being shown how to do this thing in person.
Which is interesting because I think a lot of people will think, well, that's not, then why not just do the real thing, right? But it's really a matter of being what you can give your students. And I think just going back to, first of all, to your students, because I think an important point to make is that a lot of people, are taking a degree while working or while, raising a family or while, doing some kind of other degree on the side or whatever it is that they are doing. And they just don't have the option to show up to a physical lab. Either that or the school isn't able to provide them the option of accessing a real lab, right? So it's just not an option for everyone, which I think is an important point to make as well. So that is one thing. And another thing, and this is something we've seen in studies with corporate, people, businesses training for corporate purposes. So for example, Novozymes, a big company working on enzymes, they found that, they can also replace, like you said, and it's just as good as the physical person training them And if it's just as good as, that means you can really save a lot of resources, and you can, with something digital, provide it to way more people for way less money and with way less resources.
And let me float an idea to people out there, because many people here must be educators working at universities with similar challenges as we have at ASU. And we've been very interested in what's called CURES, course-based undergraduate research experiences, which are not canned labs in online or in person. They're basically, here's a bunch of resources, come up with a question that you have, a real scientific question that's never been addressed before, design an experiment, spend the whole semester doing it. So what we thought is, if we've got these labs that are more or less equivalent to our traditional labs that we run on campus, why don't we replace those very costly traditional labs with these VR labs? And then we can take the resources we've saved and the people we've saved, time we saved, and invest it into CURES. So now we can have choices for our students. You can do the traditional labs in VR, or you can do these semester-long research experiences that are very labor-intensive. And how do you scale that up, right, to 1,000, 2,000 students? You can't if you're also doing this other stuff. So you can provide options. So this one thing we've been doing now that we've got these options is exploring, well, what can we do to change what we've been doing on ground because of now the options we have online.
Right. And that's something I think that's also unique about ASU, and what you're doing is really providing access to so many students because of your online schools, that you really can scale it up in that way that you are with the online programs. So I think, I'm just going to move on to this last question here. I think we already kind of, answered it in various ways. But this question that, was a title as well for our webinar, which is, can VR simulations replace traditional labs? And I think, in your case, it's not so much if it could, because they did, but it's if they should.
Should they, right?
Yeah.
And I think that answer is going to depend on the needs. Go back to the very first question you asked me, how did I get involved in this? My dean told me I had to build an online degree program by fall, right? That's the kind of thing deans do, right? That's why they get paid the big bucks, because they tell you got to do stuff and they make it happen. But I had to make it happen in reality. And so I was like, this was chance favoring the prepared mind, right? I wanted to find a solution to a problem. But if you're sitting there saying, well, I already have a working program at my school, we have labs, they work great, why would I be interested in VR? You should ask yourself, what would the labs for simulations, whether they're in 2D or VR, do for my program? And I think one thing that other professors have thought about is it would give my students more time with a complex lab. Maybe I want 2 or 3 lab exercises to complement what they do in, or to just be redundant to what they do in lab, because they don't get those skills down or those concepts down well during the limited time. Or maybe I have something dangerous or expensive I've always wanted to try, and we can't do it at my school. So you don't have to have an entire set of simulations replacing the traditional course. And of course, as I mentioned, my course is not just simulations, right? They do things outside of those simulations to apply those concepts and skills to hopefully show that they've learned something. So you will have to do things, right, to assess your students outside of these simulations, because I view them as formative assessment in the sense that you are letting them develop these skills in a safe place, right?
Yeah, and just by the way, in terms of assessment, there are a lot of different ways that professors use these. We've talked to a lot of, we have a lot of customers who use the simulations in many different ways. Some choose to make it mandatory, some choose to make it just, something they can do on the side if they want. Some use VR, some choose not to use VR. There are so many different ways, and you can use it as a pre-lab exercise, a post-lab exercise, exam element. You can choose to assess students like, the grade based on the simulation, based on the results in the simulation. And by the way, now I don't know if you've experienced, we have a new teacher dashboard as well that you've probably tried out as well, that you can see, the different ways that the students use the simulations, like how many times did they use it, and how did they do, and so on. Sorry? You have not? All right.
I'm praised for using technology and not exploring everything about it.
Right. I don't think that's, I think there are a lot of people out there. I'm glad that you just admit that, because But now you know there is a great teacher dashboard if you want to use it. Like I said, it varies a lot from teacher to teacher how people choose to use it, and it really is up to each individual person. It's also up to each individual student how they choose to use it. Like some just don't do the labs, right?
You can see in Canvas that stuff. So I mean, but if you're not using Canvas and you can't see it, right? You could definitely want to use the teacher dashboard.
Absolutely, yeah, because it is, I think, a good way to just like see how the student's doing, especially when you're just like online, just learning how they're doing. So let's just see. We are getting a lot of questions I can see about sort of content-specific things, like can you do simulations for this or for this? And like I said before, you know, and like you said as well, like it's a lot of stuff is possible. You can really like only, you know, the sky's the limit, and there really are no limits in terms of what's in store. So we have the ecology simulations, which came out this spring. We have chemistry simulations being launched this summer. We have microbiology, I think organic chemistry coming up the fall, end of the year. So lots of new stuff is coming out, and there is more to come. But yeah, we have to like start somewhere and then move our way through the catalogs, and we're trying to make it so that each course is sort of, you know, like saturated before we move on to the next thing, so you really can get like a full package. Oh, here's an interesting question. This is actually for us, but maybe you have an opinion on this, Mike, as well. Do you anticipate integrating social VR experiences where students and teachers can meet in real time?
That's a great question. In fact, one of the students in the survey said, what would be really great, like I really love Labster, but what would be great is if I could work with 3 other people, like in Labster.
Yeah.
So if I could do Labster, hold on, I'm going to go plug my thing, and I didn't even plug my computer.
That's fine. So while Mike is playing.
If I could do like a Labster group simulation, and you know, I think that technology exists for some platforms in VR, now obviously not for Labster, so it's not like you can't do it, and I think that would be awesome, right? Because one of the things we did in our new curriculum that we put together was we thought about skills, and some of the skills that are transferable are working in teams. Like every employer wants people that can work as part of a team effectively. So how do you develop those skills if you're an online student from your home, right? It's like being homeschooled. And so that's one of the concerns for homeschooled kids. So I think if you could work in teams in VR, that would be fantastic. You could talk more about that while I plug in my laptop.
Absolutely. Well, so this is not something that I know of, at least is currently in the pipeline, but it is definitely something that's cool. I think it's something that I remember the game The Sims that became, you know, online as well, and you could go and interact with different people. I think it requires a lot of technical details that I don't know anything about, unfortunately. But I'll definitely bring that feedback and that idea to the people developing our simulations, and I'm sure it's already been brought up before, because I mean, I think everyone agrees that that would be pretty cool. I think also, you know, maybe just going and yeah, being able to, I think there are forums like outside of Labster where you can discuss different things, or the teachers set that up with their students where they can discuss the different things. So in that sense, it is possible, like you said as well, Mike. You know, if you can't do it in one way, then you find another way to use it. So yeah, who knows? Maybe one day it'll be really exciting to see, at least.
I think what's going to happen, and you know, this is obviously something you guys at Labster should think about. What's going to happen is other players will get into this field, right? Like you're the first ones in the lab VR market. Once other companies get involved, it's going to drive basically competition, which is going to mean every company is going to try to build the next thing. Like we've got gloves, you know, like we've got the Xbox Kinects. That was the thing a few years ago. Or we've got the group work. And so I view this as just the beginning. I mean, I can't imagine because of gaming that VR isn't going to take off. And actually it kind of scares me to think my family might be sitting around a table eating dinner with their goggles on. Not looking at each other, to be honest.
Yeah, I mean, one can only imagine what will happen with VR. I think, you know, like you said, there's definitely competition out there. I think not anyone who has the same, or at least something that kind of comes close to what we're doing right now, but we're definitely, you know, ready for the competition when it does come. And we're really glad to have great partners like Google and like UASU standing by our side in this. And I think it's just, you know, it's always professors using the simulations, people co-developing our simulations with us, that makes it the high quality that it is. We're always looking for great collaborators like you guys to make sure that we develop the best possible content. So that being said, I just want to see, because we do have only 5 minutes left now, I just want to make sure that we cover as many questions as possible. Yeah, I can see there's another one here where people are asking if you can work together in teams. So I'll definitely bring that one. And yeah, multiple players, a lot of people, yeah, and interaction. So for the ones that have sent more specific and long questions, I think I'll be sure to follow up on those and maybe forward those to you as well, Mike, so you can be included in the chat in case they're for you. And then there are a few questions about costs. I think the best option for you to do there is just to reach out to us at labs.com/pricing. It really depends on, you know, students, like class size and yeah, what kind of technology you want to use and all these kinds of different things. So reach out to us and we'll be able to help you out there. Yeah, so I also want to just, so we did the question and answers now. I just want to, before we wrap up here, also say that you can always learn more about this simulations at labs.com/VR. And yeah, so any last remarks from you, Mike? I think it's been great to have you on board here. Do you have any last comments or anything we didn't talk about?
For saving my online degree in Google. And yeah, I was very pleased with how it went with the course. I'm glad the students enjoyed it, and I look forward to whatever innovations that you guys come up with in the future.
Sounds great. Thank you so much, everyone, for joining out there, and we hope to see you again in our next webinar. So head on over to labs.com/webinars to see what's next. And thank you again so much for joining, Mike. Bye, guys.